Berri in particular, joining us at 7:30 a.m. Where he is in the US, Mountain Time. For many of us, good afternoon. Welcome to our 122nd Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. As already mentioned, we have Dave Berri. I'm very pleased to have Dave presenting his work, joint work with a number of co-authors. Before that, I just wanted to flag to your attention in the invite a few conferences. One in particular that's taking place quite soon, Maxence Franceschi, who's regular in these meetings. Again, hopefully he's made it into the right room, but he is part of a conference on the legal and economic aspects of the organisation of football in Europe, which is taking place in 11 days, February the 21st in Luxembourg, but it's also live streamed, and there's a link on the calendar invite that I sent out earlier on today, an Eventbrite link where you can sign up to attend that conference. The other thing to say is that some deadlines for conferences are upcoming, and if you like me and miss them, then I'm going to try and help you and remind you, in process hopefully reminding myself as well. That is that the North American Association of Sports Economists meeting at the Western Economic Association conference in San Diego. Deadline for an abstract submission for that is the 15th February, so 5 days away. And also the 10th Math Sport International Conference in Budapest on June the 26th to 28th. That has an extended abstract deadline, also February the 15th. So 2 upcoming deadlines, a bunch of the deadlines for conferences in March and April. Have a look in the calendar invite for those. I'm not going to put Dave on hold any longer. Dave, all over to you for your presentation, which is entitled, I believe, Gender Bias and Perceived Quality, an Experiment with Elite Soccer Performance.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all joining us. That's very nice of you. See if I can share my screen here. Let's see here. I want that right there. So you can see that, right?
Yep.
All right, then we're in good shape. All right, so this is the title. At least I think that's, well, it's close to the title. So this is a paper, a joint paper. This is the actual title I think we ended up with. So this is a paper with Carlos Gomez and Helmut and Cornell, and called Gender Stereotypes and Perceived Quality, an Experiment with Professional Soccer Performance. So I'm going to go through and do some background on women in sports, and then sort of gradually move towards what this particular study is going to be all about. So this is sort of where I want to begin. This was a statement made by U.S. Soccer, specifically lawyers for U.S. Soccer. If you may recall, if we think about world competition and where the United States sort of fits into international football on that. The men's side of international football for the U.S. is very bad. They tend not to win much of anything. They struggle even to make the World Cup. The women's side of U.S. soccer is quite successful. And so they tend to win quite a bit. Despite that, historically, U.S. soccer has paid the men a good deal more than the women. And the women took U.S. soccer to court over this. And in court, the lawyers for U.S. soccer argued that the men and women playing in fundamentally different worlds. The overall soccer playing ability required to compete at the senior men's national level is materially influenced by a level of certain physical attributes such as speed and strength required for the job. These are uncontroverted facts. Men play a different game. Men are bigger, stronger, faster. And their argument was that men get paid more because men are better at this than women. And so that it justifies the pay difference. The result of that statement was the head of U.S. Soccer ended up being fired over that, and eventually, and also U.S. Soccer lost a lot of sponsors, and eventually U.S. Soccer agreed to pay equal wages to men and women anyways. But the statement itself that men are simply better at sports than women seems to be something that's not entirely an idea held by the lawyers for U.S. Soccer or the men at U.S. Soccer, although it's not the players at U.S. Soccer, it's the head of U.S. Soccer. But this also seems to be something a lot of men think when they think about women's sports. Men are simply better at sports than women, and so this is something that drives what, in their mind, this is what drives differences we see between men and women's sports in all sorts of aspects. So I want to go through and just note the basic differences first. Is that men's sports, when it comes to the economic issues, if you think about demand and broadcasting revenue and franchise value and athlete pay and investment, men's sports definitely consistently get more than women. So we understand the economics. We want to go through, I want to start off with talking about why there are those economic differences before we get to this issue that maybe it's men are simply are perceived to be better than women at this. So we're going to start with the time story. This is one way of thinking about the story of time. If you think about the English Premier League begins as the first division of the Football League in 1888. So that's how far this goes back. In 1921, women in England are effectively banned. That ban stays in place till 1972. The Women's Super League in England appears in 2010. And as I've noted in a number of articles I've written, that for fanatics to appear or fans to appear takes a great deal of time. If you look at attendance numbers in the early history of men's professional soccer in England, or if you look at it in the National Football League or the NBA or Major League Baseball, fans don't appear instantly. It usually takes decades for a fan base to develop. So one reason why men's sports gets more fans than women's sports is that women's sports has not been allowed to develop. We should not expect leagues that have only existed for a few years to have a very large fan base. So we want to note that. So there's the time issue. There's the investment issue. This is one of the stories that I like, this particular story. David Tepper, who owns the Carolina Panthers, is a hedge fund billionaire, paid $325 million for a Major League Soccer team in Charlotte. As the people, I'm sure the people in Europe are aware of this. Major League Soccer is not really aptly named. The major soccer leagues are primarily in Europe. They're not the United States. Major League Soccer is better thought of as minor league soccer. It's not on par with the English Premier League or any of the other number of leagues in Europe. But this is what David Tepper paid for a minor league soccer team. Now we compare that franchise price, that level of investment, to what we see in women. This actually was a story that appeared just yesterday. So I had a different way of explaining this before yesterday, but I saw this yesterday. I thought this is actually a better way of saying the same thing. So the Wall Street Journal reported the Seattle Storm, which is one of the top franchises in the WNBA, is valued at $151 million. So that's an estimate, by journalists, of course. Actual franchise values: Washington Spirit in the National Women's Soccer League sold for $35 million recently. Gotham FC sold for $40 million. Portland Thorn have been valued at $60 million. Angel City is valued at more than $100 million. One of the things that's interesting about Angel City is that, just going back, one man came up with $325 million for the Charlotte team in Major League Soccer. Angel City has a number of celebrity investors, a large number of celebrity investors. Not any of them came up with $100 million. They all came up with a much smaller amount of money to buy into the team. And so they managed to get investors, but they had to get a lot of them to even come up with that amount of money. And then, as this article noted, Mark Davis, who owns the Las Vegas Raiders of the NFL, bought the Las Vegas Aces, and the report is that he might have paid just about $2 million for it. So there's a massive difference in valuations between the franchises for men and the franchises for women. So we see that. It's not just differences in private investment. There's huge differences in public investment. This was a big story that came out a couple years ago. the owners of the Kansas City National Women's Soccer League announced that they were going to build a stadium for their team. It was going to cost $70 million. And what's interesting about the story, at least from an economic perspective, is first, this is the first stadium built strictly for a women's professional sports team in North America. So it's the only purpose of this structure is going to be for this women's team. Secondly, the owners of the team are building it. This is not built with public money, which is a very different story when we turn to the men's side in North America. Victor Matheson has done a lot of research on this and has noted that teams in the National Football League and NBA and NHL and Major League Baseball have received billions and billions of dollars in public subsidies. Major League Soccer, again, a minor soccer league, has also received subsidies of close to $2 billion to build arenas for their teams. We don't see that on the women's side. Women do not get large amounts of public investment. So it's not just that men get this giant head start to build their fan bases. Men also get this huge amount of private and public investment not available to women. And then there is, of course, the media story. If you look at the sports media, so this, just to go back, this story came from Just Women's Sport. This is an internet site dedicated just to women's sports. It's a small website. It's growing, but there aren't very many sites like that. There are lots of websites dedicated. What they say is they're dedicated to sports. ESPN says they cover sports. But if you look, they primarily cover men's sports. Studies show that women's sports receives less than 5% of the media coverage that we see. And that's actually, I do an exercise in my classes when I teach this to demonstrate that 4%. You just call up ESPN's main website and just look at the stories that are being covered, and you can see very clearly that well over 90% of these are stories about men's sports. There are occasional stories about women's sports, but not very many. And so the focus clearly is on men's sports. So we think about why do men's sports do better economically than women's sports? We have the time story, the investment story, we have the media story, and then we have the story that we're getting at in this study, and that is this idea that men do better than women simply because the quality of men's athletic contests are better than women's sports. So there's these assertions that women's sports are boring and they're slow, and therefore, because they're not as interesting, there's less reason to invest in them, and there's less reason to provide media coverage. And so this is a stereotype that we have, that people believe that if you look at men and women playing sports, the men's version of the sport is simply more interesting and more exciting than the women's game. I often am told this by men in my classes that they don't like women's sports because they don't think women's sports are as interesting as men's sports. And one of the things I note beyond this study that we're going to go through in a moment here is that a reason why you're going to find sports to be less interesting is if you're less familiar with what you're watching. So one way of illustrating this point is that a significant number of people who live in the United States are not actually fans of the most popular sport in the world, and that, of course, is soccer. And why are they not fans? Well, they're not familiar with it. They don't know the players. They don't know the game. They don't know what they're watching. And so from their perspective, their attitude is, well, this is not as interesting as the sports I'm familiar with. And so that is exactly how interest works. So one reason why people might say this is simply because they're less familiar. But what we want to do in this study is actually do a little better than that. We want to actually provide a test of this idea that women's sports are not as interesting. So in this paper, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be examining these beliefs that women are athletically inferior to men. And so we're going to empirically test if individuals rate the quality of women's and men's soccer performance differently if they cannot see the gender of the player. So that's the big thing here. So we set up the paper, we go through and we talk about the literature from gender studies. So hegemonic masculinity and gender imprinting are words that we're using here. This is something I teach gender economics, and I try and teach it from a not just from a perspective the way economists think about gender, but also from a perspective of the way this field is presented in gender studies. And I think, you know, just as an aside, I think if you're going to talk about gender economic issues, you probably should spend some time reading through the literature from gender studies and getting a sense of these things, because often it's the case when we're looking at outcomes in gender economics and we're saying, hey, there is a difference between men and women in terms of some sort of behavior or some sort of outcome. The economist who's not familiar with the gender studies literature is not going to fully understand why they're seeing that differences. You do have to understand differences in the way in which societies treat men and women to understand why we would see differences in behaviors. And so we spent some time in the paper talking about those sort of things. And I think that's a really useful thing to do. If you're going to be doing this kind of research, you should spend some time thinking about those sort of things rather than just trying to do the research just relying on what tends to be in the economics literature, which is often written by people who, from my experience, there's a lot of that's written by people who don't really spend a lot of time thinking about the underlying gender issues that might be driving the results they're seeing. So you want to understand that. And so that's just an aside. Okay. All right. On to our experiment. This is the experiment. So we selected 10 videos from women's and men's clubs and from 2019. The videos were between 5 and 14 seconds each. They're goal scoring plays. All matches are either from the World Cup or Champion League matches. The goal scorers include a lot of very famous players from around the world, both men and women. So these are supposed to be very exciting plays and plays that people would like to watch. And again, there are 10 of them. 5 of them are from women. 5 of them are from men. And so these are the actual plays, and again, they vary in length. But we have 5 that are from men, we have 5 that are from women, and the question we're asking here is we're going to conceal the gender of the players. So we're going to we manipulated every video frame to conceal the gender of the players. So we're blurring the videos, and so that's and then we're going to ask, you know, a very basic question here. How does your perception of what you're seeing change when we show the videos unblurred, so you can see that it's men and women, and then how does your perception of the video, is it different when you can't tell the gender? So that's it's a fairly you know, I believe it's Carlos originated this idea. It's a fairly clever idea from Carlos, and it's pretty simple and straightforward. So this is what it looks like, just what a picture of the video would look like. So this is a picture on one side on the left, unblurred. You can see who's playing, and then this is going to be the same outcome on the right hand side where it's blurred. And so that's what we're going to be asking. So you're going to be seeing the play. They see the play. And so they can assess how exciting it is or how interesting it is. And so they can rate that. And then we're going to ask, does it make a difference if you can't see the actual gender of this? The way the study is done, there's 2 groups of people that are being asked to view the videos. In the control group, there's 290 participants. They're evaluating the 10 videos where nothing is blurred. And then there's the treatment group, 323 participants evaluate the same sequence, but with the videos blurred. And so the only difference is the videos are blurred or unblurred. And so the question is, they're asked then to rate what they are seeing here. This is just the descriptive statistics. And the descriptive statistics, you know, I highlighted in red what you're seeing here without controlling for anything. So this is the participant rating for the women's videos. 1 is poor, 5 is excellent. When the videos are unblurred, the women get a 3.8 score. When it's blurred, they get a 3.58 score. So the scores do go down when you blur them, which is not surprising. When you do the men's rate higher when they're not blurred, so they get a 4, but it goes down to 3.56 when it's blurred. What you see here, you can see here, it's not hard to see this, is that the women and men are rated pretty close when they're blurred. They're not rated close when they're unblurred. So we're going to do a little bit more than that in telling the story, but that captures essentially the story that we're going to be telling here. So this is just looking at each video one by one, and you can see what the ratings are. And again, when they're blurred, they're rated lower. And that's not surprising. But these are the actual scores, the average scores for each one. This is looking at the unblurred women and men. You can see men are rated again higher, blurred, rated basically the same. Okay, so again, story that you see just in the raw data. Then we did a little bit more here. We did some basic regression analysis, and we're looking here at, in this first one, we're looking at what explains the video evaluation. And of course, we're first considering is the video of the women. Then we consider a number of control variables, gender of the participant, age of the participant, do they normally watch soccer, do they watch a lot of soccer, do they prefer women's soccer, do they prefer men's soccer, and again, there are those who have no preference at all. And then, so that's our basic model here. And you can see, when we look at the coefficients for the women's video, that when you blur the videos, there's no statistical difference for the women's videos. When you unblur them, women are rated lower. Okay. We then so that's our first result. So participants who watch the unblurred videos rate women's videos significantly lower. Once the videos are blurred, participants no longer rates men and women's videos any differently, so that's our first set of results here. So we then did some interactions. We interacted the gender with the who's in the video, and to see if that changes the result any when we take into account interaction effects between the gender of the people playing soccer and the gender of the people viewing it. And the result ends up being the same. Again, the women are rated lower. When we blur it, there's no difference again. So that ends up being the same basic story. So interacting the gender does not change the basic story that we're telling. So the results show that men evaluate women's videos significantly lower than men's videos under the unblurred conditions. When the videos are blurred, this difference disappears. So that's, so again, we're seeing the basic same story there. And then we did a study where we're looking at willingness to pay. So your willingness to pay to watch women and men's soccer. And when you unblur the videos, your willingness to pay for women's soccer goes down. When you blur the videos, there's no difference. Again, that's the same basic story. And so consistent with our results from before, when the player's gender is visible, participants report being significantly less likely to pay to watch a women's video. As expected, participants who regularly watch soccer are more willing to pay to watch matches, so that's not surprising. But the issue with respect to gender, when you blur the videos and they can't tell the gender, they don't seem to have this preference that we see before. So this study has some implications for how it is soccer, how it is you're pitching your sports to people, and so one of the things that we suggest is that it does tell you something about how it is when you are trying to advertise your sport and trying to get people interested in your sport. Our results are showing that and this is something that I've also talked about in other research, that one of the very big things here is that people focus on absolute differences when they talk about women's sports. But we know from looking at other sports that it's relative differences that drive demand, not absolute differences. I'm going to go through some examples of what I'm talking about with respect to that. So this is my favorite example. This example is from an article that I wrote for Forbes about 5 years ago, and the article came about from a tweet that somebody sent out, and I don't know the person who sent the tweet out. I do link to the tweet in my Forbes article, so you can go see the tweet, but I don't know who wrote it. It was just some tweet I saw, and the tweet was pointing out that when it comes to sports like boxing, we don't think about absolute differences, we think about relative differences. So if you think about, and they do this all the time in boxing, who is the best pound for pound boxer? So now going back to our story of men and women, men are saying, hey, men are better than women. If they played soccer against each other, we think the men would win, and that might be true. But that's not the way we evaluate men. The top pound for pound boxer, according to ESPN last August, was Terence Crawford, who's a welterweight. He weighs 147 pounds. He is not allowed to fight Tyson Fury, who weighs 270 pounds. We would not schedule such a fight because the reason why weight classes exist is because we tend to think that if you put a smaller person in a ring with a very large person, that smaller person could end up very seriously hurt or dead. So that doesn't seem to be a very entertaining sport. So we don't allow that to happen. These weight classes are very religiously enforced. The belief is that being bigger than your opponent gives you a huge advantage. And so you would think if absolute differences are all that matters, then Tyson Fury would be the boxer that people would want to watch. And every time Canelo Alvarez, who weighs 165 pounds, goes in the ring, people would be saying, he only weighs 165 pounds. He cannot possibly be thought of as one of the best boxers in the world. There are a lot of people much bigger than him. He can't be the best fighter out there. But the market says Canelo Alvarez makes a tremendous amount of money. Tyson Fury doesn't make quite as much because the idea is that Canelo Alvarez, relative to his competition, Terence Crawford, relative to his competition, is much better than Tyson Fury relative to his competition. That's the story that people are telling. They're looking at relative differences, not absolute differences. And then we see that same story when we look at all sorts of different sports. So the way I would have you think about this is what matters in sports is being the best in your class, not the absolute best. So a boxing match between, again, two top lightweights will draw better than a boxing match between two lower ranked heavyweights. A college basketball game between two top teams in the United States is going to draw a much bigger audience than the G League. So the G League is the NBA's minor league. So you think about who's in the NBA. The NBA consists of something around 500 players, and those are the best players in the world. The G League are the players right below that. They are very, very good basketball players, and some of them actually will go, and many of them will actually play in the NBA or have played in the NBA. But they're not quite the top 500. They're just right below that. The average G League team, though, because it consists of many players who will be in the NBA, is likely better than many of the top college teams who may have only 2 or 3 professional players who will eventually be professionals. But a G League team, the average G League team draws about 2,500 fans a game. That's it. The league's been around for about 25 years. It doesn't have any fan base. It's very similar story to minor league baseball in the United States. The top minor league baseball team before the pandemic was drawing 10,000 fans per game. The average was 3,000. These are minor league baseball players are some of the best baseball players in the world, but they can't get any fans. Minor league baseball teams are certainly better than college teams would be, but they can't draw any fans because they're not in. When you think about what is the G League class, the NBA class is adult men. minor league baseball, Major League Baseball, adult men. Best in class is the major league, not the minor league. When we look at college teams, your class is college students between the age of 18 and 22. You've defined the class, so therefore you have, the audience is saying that is, University of Alabama in football, that's the best in the class, so therefore they're going to be interesting to me to watch. And so you see that over and over again, that when it comes to men's sports, the distinction is it's best in class, not absolute best, that matters. Somehow, when it switches over to women's sports, that argument gets lost. And so what you end up seeing is suddenly men are talking about absolute differences rather than relative differences. So when you ask people who's the best tennis player in the 21st century, they'll say, Roger Federer or Djokovic. And men are not as willing to say, well, Serena Williams, right? Serena Williams would be the best. And the argument that men will say is, well, I'm not sure Serena Williams could beat Roger Federer. That's irrelevant, just as it's irrelevant whether Canelo Alvarez can beat Tyson Fury. That's irrelevant. She's better than her competition compared to the men, so therefore she's best in class. So that's what matters, okay? And so what I think, one of the things that we're arguing in this paper is that managers in women's sports can learn something from the way boxing gets promoted and the way these other sports get promoted. They don't emphasize the absolute differences, they emphasize the relative differences. And so the key is to focus on the skills and the talents and the relative competition, and make the argument that this is just as engaging and just as interesting as anything that you're seeing on the men's side. And just as I've noticed this as I have written about the WNBA and watched a lot of the WNBA and gotten to know people in the WNBA. And one of the things that I notice when we think about differences between men and women and the way they play, women's basketball, for me, because I'm now familiar with the players and familiar with the teams, it appears more interesting to me now because the court seems too small. It seems after you watch a lot of women's basketball, it ends up saying the men's sport seems a little small. They're so much bigger than the court. James Naismith, when he invented the sport, didn't design it for people to play who were 7 feet tall. That's why he put the basket only 10 feet off the ground. So it's one of these things, as you watch more and more women's sports, you start to appreciate, again, you appreciate the relative competition that you're seeing. It's irrelevant whether or not those women can beat men. And so the last thing I would note here is this is a very famous story in men and women's sports, is this battle of the sexes from the 1970s, where we see Billie Jean King, the top woman in women's tennis, takes on Bobby Riggs in a tennis match. It was played at the Houston Superdome. It was broadcast on national television in prime time. They had a huge audience for this. Can a woman beat a man in tennis? And there's a tendency for people to want to talk about that type of issue, but to me, this is irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference whether women can beat men in sports or not. It is certainly the case that the top women in sports can beat 99% of men in sports. That is true, but it's irrelevant whether the very top women can beat the very top men. It just says it's irrelevant whether a smaller man can beat a bigger man in boxing. And I think that's what we're trying to show in this paper, is that when you blur the gender, it may be the case that men are faster than women, but once you blur the video, you can't actually tell that when you're watching it. You don't have a stopwatch in your head that you can see this, and that's why this study kind of is important, because it shows that. Okay, all right. So that is the study. So we can talk about what we found here. I don't know if we're planning on. Let's see if we can do that. All right, so there we go. All right, so James, are we going to go for another 55 minutes?
Go for as long as people want to give you questions for, Dave. So
I may not have 55 minutes of answers, but we'll see what I have. So, but we'll open up to questions. So, any thoughts?
First
Pete has a question
coming in is from Pete.
Yeah, I was curious when you blurred did you ask what gender people thought they were watching?
So I am not the one who does I did not do that part of the study, Pete. So I don't know. That's a good question, though, isn't it? I don't know.
That would be interesting to put in if you have it.
If you have it, okay, good. Carlos is here. Thank you, Carlos. Carlos knows.
Hello.
Carlos knows the answers. Thank you, Carlos.
Brilliant. It was a brilliant presentation, so I couldn't explain it better. Regarding this question, so we don't ask participants whether they are able to distinguish the gender. We run some tests ourselves to check for that, and they cannot actually identify the gender. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong, but in the actual sample that we use, we don't have that question.
Yeah, well, I was more curious about not whether they identify it correctly, but what their perception was, because that might affect their view. But if you don't have it, you don't have it. Good paper, though. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, the point is when we did it, so participants didn't know that they were participating in a study about gender. So they only had to rate soccer, right? Soccer plays. And when I ran this, the test, some of them, they thought all of the videos were from men. Actually, they were discussing, they were completely wrong. We are buying the actual paper, we don't have that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. Daniel, you had his hand up next, so Daniel, go ahead. You're on mute.
Okay, sorry, very interesting paper, really enjoyed it. I guess, one question is the fact that you're selecting for the videos, goals and other highlights. Is that something that, you may be worried that biases in favor of not finding differences in the blurred case? Because, those are spectacular things that, we all enjoy. So you focus on the quality of the strike, of the shot, of the save, whatever, and it looks very good. If you were to, watch a 2-minute video of midfield passes and things, it could be that the differences would show up also in the blurred videos. So just a thought.
See, Carlos, that's the second paper. There you go, right there. There you go. Paper number 2.
This is a very relevant point, and we discussed it several times. So we decided to include highlights because it's exactly the most exciting part of the game. And actually, consumption tends to be now towards more highlights and towards less complete matches for young people. That's the first reason that we chose the highlights. And we couldn't include other type of plays because it takes really long to blur the videos. So first we tried with a machine learning algorithm. It took the computer way too long to actually blur the complete frame of the whole video. And there were mistakes. And in these mistakes, it could be possible to identify some of the parts of the body that would give away the gender. And that's what we actually did. It was hard work, frame by frame, applying this blurred, how do you say that, the level of blurriness that we applied frame by frame. And that's how we got to get the videos. Yeah, ideally, we will have also a higher number of videos and longer videos, shorter videos, and videos that do not include goals and videos that do include goals. But yeah, this is our first study, and I hope as a line of research, some people would also jump on board and contribute.
So can I just follow up on that? There's a paper that I think was presented maybe at the Sloan conference that was looking at racial differences and whether similar idea, like if you blur the identity of the players, do you perceive black players to be sort of more aggressive, more violent? And I don't know what their blurring technology was, but that could be something that you may be interested in.
Okay, where was this paper presented?
I think it was presented at the Sloan, the Sloan Sports Conference, and it's not by economists.
Okay.
And if I'll find the link, I'll send it to you.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Daniele. Juan de Dios has his hand up next.
Okay. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Just a follow-up question about the same topic. Is the same topic? It's about the experiment. The fact that you find different results when the image is blurred and when it's not blurred, could be an indication of the gender bias, but could be an indication of simply that you cannot appreciate the quality of the game. I know you can have reservations about it, but I think a very useful falsification test in this case would be to compare with a game from a lower tier of a top division, for example, the second or third tier. So if you can prove that this bias, this gender bias exists only with gender, but not when you blur a match of lower quality in men's football, that would be a clear proof that of the story.
Carlos, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you, Juan de Dios. So if I understand you correctly, what you would do is to run the same experiment, but with lower divisions players, and see if we do find the same result?
Well, it'd be a different result then, right? It'd be that you'd find that the ones at the lower quality, it's supposed to be that they should be able to see the lower quality as lower quality. That's what he's saying.
Okay. Yeah, I see that.
I wonder if that I would wonder if that's actually true. So I wonder whether sports fans could tell the difference between a college football game and an NFL game if I didn't tell you what you were watching. Because I think for a lot of sports fans, they're like, well, because this is something that comes up in the NFL, because they're going to do, unlike Europe, they do a draft. So they had these quarterbacks play college football, and they look amazing because they're playing against college football players, and they're like, this guy completes like every pass he throws. He's amazing. Yeah, he's playing against somebody who's no good. Of course he looks amazing. And then he gets to the NFL, and they're like, oh my God, he's awful. Well, yeah, those are better players. And so that's a case where it's professional scouts who are supposed to know that there is a difference in quality, and they can't figure it out. They do this all the time. They're constant, and they do this in baseball. They'll look at a high school kid playing baseball, and they'll say, he has all the tools. He hits like 450. He's amazing. Yeah, he's playing against a 16-year-old. That doesn't mean anything. What's he going to do when he faces somebody who's 40 years old? He's going to get killed. And so, yeah, I get the sense of the test, and I don't know what we would find doing that, because I don't know that anyone can tell differences. I just think that if you can fool the scouts, you got to be able to fool the average fan. And I think what would be an interesting study is to do that study, and I think the result would be they couldn't tell the difference. And I think what we would learn is that nobody knows that the English Premier League is better than the other leagues unless we tell you. Unless we tell you these are the best players. Okay, I got it. They're the best players. They're not. This is not the third tier. So okay. I think that's true. I could be wrong about that, but I think given that we have a long history of scouts getting fooled, I would imagine us average fans get fooled all the time.
It's a challenge, Dave, because as a fan of a 5th division football team here in England, I reckon I could tell the difference between the 5th division and the 1st division. But it's a challenge because I've not been given blurred images. So,
yeah, that's right. You haven't been, and I'm just saying by what I've seen, just in Rob and I have done studies of the NFL draft, and they get fooled all the time into thinking this player is amazing against inferior competition, and they have no way of adjusting for that. They don't. And then because, one of the things that we see in the NFL is there's just no difference where the quarterbacks get drafted and how they play, because the scouts just are guessing. They have no idea what they're looking at. They just get fooled all the time. And so I think we tend to think as fans that we can tell that, I can tell that player is way better than that player. And I think the reality is, well, if I stick anybody up against people who aren't that good, you're going to look pretty amazing. And so I don't know. That's just my thought. But it'd be an interesting study to do.
Danielle's put the link in the chat, and Pete has his hand up as well.
Yeah, you had the gender of the participants that did the study. Did you see if there's a difference between women and men's evaluations right off? So split the sample.
Yes, we do have the gender of the participants, and there seems to be a small difference when we run the interactions, and is that men, if I remember correctly, tend to evaluate lower women's soccer when this is not blurred. So part of the difference that we find comes from men. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. Any more questions and comments? Actually, I've got a second hand. So yeah, Michel has his hand up. Go ahead. Now, Michel, you might be on mute.
Mute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Go ahead, Anwasia.
Yeah, so as a robustness check and related to the first comment, can you have another treatment where you probably show them the blurred clips and ask them about their gender perception based on some kind of rating? Either ask them to first rate the match or show them some existing ratings from the previous participants and then ask them to perceive the gender of the players.
Yeah, there are different things that that we can run with this experiment because it is interesting. We didn't do any of that in the one that we already did. The thing, not asking about whether they could perceive or not the gender, we also discussed quite a bit about this, and we didn't want to give away the experiment because if we asked about the gender, we ran into a trouble they identified that they were answering something that had to do with gender, right?
Yeah,
and that was exactly what we didn't want. So we didn't want to risk any of the experiment on one of these gender questions, and that's why we kept it very simple. So we only ask for each video these two questions. How would you rate the quality, and would you be willing to pay to see the whole match? And we only ask about their demographics either at the beginning or at the end. We also try both things to double check that there was not a problem. And that's all we included in the experiment we already ran. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anwasia. Michel, you want to try asking your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, got you.
Is it me? Okay. So many thanks for an interesting presentation. I find your argument about relative differences very compelling, but it doesn't apply to all the sports where it kind of should, right? In boxing or judo, we have weight, like you said, but you can imagine a league of volleyball, for example, in which only people below 6 feet tall are allowed to compete. It could be very interesting, and yet it doesn't exist. So it's not only about gender. There could be other reasons why this argument does not apply. So do you have a sense of why, what could be driving this discrepancy, these differences between disciplines, so that in some we somehow care only about absolute differences, in others we care about relative differences and who's the best in his or her class?
Well, they did try to start a basketball league once of men who are 6 feet or shorter, but the problem you're going to have I don't think you should infer from the fact that league didn't succeed as indication that people wanted absolute versus relative difference. The league didn't exist long enough for us to ever figure out what was going on there. A league has to exist for a long period of time to build up a fan base, and if it doesn't exist that long, well, there's not going to be any fan base anyways, no matter what you're doing. So that's the issue there, is that it's hard to test that story because you'd have to have the league last long enough for a fan base to even develop. This relates to a different question, a similar question. I brought this up in one of my classes last week because we were talking about this issue of boring versus not boring. And I made the observation about arena football versus the National Football League. So arena football is the same sport as American football, but it's played on a 50-yard field, so that every single play is potentially a scoring play because you're always within striking distance to score. And so I think objectively, arena football is more exciting than American football, which takes place on a 100-yard field, and most plays don't mean anything. So I think that's objectively, I think we could argue that. But arena football has never found an audience. And the reason why is because the Arena Football League never lasted long enough to find an audience. The longest running of the league was like 20 years, and that's just not enough to build up a fan base. And so consequently never went anywhere. So I think, there's a sense that people go, hey, what I really want is exciting. Well, yeah, but you also want to be you have to be emotionally attached to the teams. That's the issue. And so James just said, I'm a fan of a 5th-tier soccer team. Why are you a fan of well, how long have you been a fan of this team, right? This is a long time, right? Yep. And I'm a fan of the Detroit Lions, who are a 5th-tier NFL team. And so why am I a fan of Lions? Well, I started being a fan of Lions when I was 7 years old. And so I've been stuck with them ever since. And so I think when we think about demand for sports, we tend to focus in on things like wins and excitement and stuff like that. But there's this emotional attachment that builds up across time. And what's really interesting about sports demand is that emotional attachment can't be broken even when the product that you're given is awful. I don't know of any consumer sport, any good in consumption that if I keep giving you something bad, you keep buying it from me. But we do that in sports. Like James is addicted to a bad team. I'm addicted to a bad team. And so I get the question, but I don't know how you would test that without a league lasting long enough for us to see it.
Alex has a question.
Hi, thank you. Very nice paper. I probably missed it, but who are the participants and how did you allocate them these videos? How did it work, the experiment? Were they randomly assigned to treatment and control? How did it work?
Yeah, so in our experiment, by design, we could not randomize who went to the control and who went to the treatment group. They did it by themselves. We checked that our sample is more or less homogeneous, and it is. The only condition that is different is the gender of the participants. We have a little bit more men in the treatment than in the control, but we run several robustness checks where we randomly select a sample that is homogeneous for both groups, and we test that several times, and we find that this doesn't change the results that we have.
So, but it wasn't like students. I was sure it's students.
No, it is participants from Amazon Mechanical Turk. These are people that do the experiment online. So we held the whole experiment online, and we rewarded some of the participants all of the participants for their responses on the platform.
Okay, I see. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Any more questions and comments?
Glad you came.
Just before Danielle jumps in, I'll say a comment based on what you were saying a moment ago, Dave, is attachment to a really bad football team and the fact that or the way in which women's leagues might catch on in the same way that men's leagues have. You're probably aware that if you go back 25, 30 years in England, the women's game was all teams you never heard of, like Doncaster Bells and other teams like this, whereas now it's the same teams as the men's teams. So I can be a fan of Oldham Athletics women's team because I'm a fan of their men's team. I don't really think that kind of grafting in of a fan culture, whether that might, aid.
I totally agree with that, because that's exactly what happens in college sports in America, is that you see these fans switch so that, women like softball has, the Oklahoma Sooners have a huge women's softball team, and they get a huge fan base because there already are fans of Oklahoma sports. And I think that's a huge lesson, because asking fans to emotionally attach to something they've never heard of before. That's what I see when I look at the early history of men's sports. And I always tell students, you know, you go back to the early history of the NBA and they're introducing these teams which have all college players that everyone at that time would have heard of. They would have, these are all stars. Men's college basketball is already very popular. You already heard of these people. Then you stick them on teams, and the teams are called Minneapolis Lakers and Boston Celtics. And I just imagine a fan being presented a game between the Celtics and Lakers going, I don't know what the hell is a Laker? Are you just making up words? What does that mean? Why am I supposed to root for this? And you're like, it's George Mikan. He was at DePaul. It's like, but you called him a Laker. I don't know what that means, and I don't know why I would watch that. And I think that's the big thing, is that I really think it's going to be a really cool experiment here to see how quickly the Women's Super League in England takes off, because they've identified with these men's teams, compared to the National Women's Soccer League, where they've gone in alone and the teams are just things you've never heard of before. And I think that's crucial. I think doing that, you know, you want to tap into these fan bases and give them a reason to root for them, because they've already formed the emotional attachment. So take advantage of that. I think that's true.
Yeah. Danielle.
Yeah, so just on that last point, I completely agree. And so I'm a fan of the Juventus women's soccer team, who, you know, did quite well in the Champions League last year. I just wanted to sort of comment on the you know, on the discussion about sort of, you know, different levels of the, you know, of soccer. This reminds a lot about, you know, research has been done about sort of wine, so-called wine experts, that they're given, you know, wine bottles to taste, and then, you know, they show the price or they don't show the price. And, you know, when they show the price, they say, oh, this wine is excellent. And when they sort of hide the prices of the bottles, then they can't really tell what is supposed to be a good wine versus the other. So that's, and that's, I think that touches also on the difference between men and women.
I love that story. My favorite one along that one was where they took the white wine and put red food coloring in it. and then the wine taster like, this is a fantastic red wine. No, it is not. You're not even close. How do you not know this? Yeah, it is the case that experts get fooled all the time on things that you think they're supposed to know, and they don't know. And this happens all the time. And you know, the trick in being an expert is just to state things confidently. It's not actually knowing anything in particular. And so that's, you know, I think that's true. So
I hope that doesn't say anything about you.
Well, I state things confidently all the time, so I'm very big on doing stuff. I think economists do.
Just kidding.
We do the same thing, right? Don't we do the same thing as economists? You ask us a question and we state confidently, you know, what we think the answer is, right? I have one of the quotes I show my students is from Larry Summers, where he's asked about forecasting the economy, and he states in the quote, in the first sentence, he says, well, you know, we don't really know how to forecast the economy. And then the very next sentence in the same interview, he says, I think there's a 50% chance we'll have a recession next year. And I'm saying, you just said you couldn't do that. No, you're saying you can do that. And it's like, he couldn't stop himself. I know intellectually I don't know anything, but I'm going to tell you anyways. And I think that's like the wine taster going, I actually can't tell the difference in these two wines, but I'm going to tell you anyways, because I can't stop myself. So I think we do that all the time. I think that's just what we do. So, and I do think there's a gender difference, but I think men are more inclined to do that than women. Hence the word mansplaining. So that's so.
More questions and comments? Oh, Rob.
Oh, it's Rob. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Dave. I enjoyed that. Just to clear one point up, do I take it that in these videos, the participants can't figure out who the teams are? You're ruling that out?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the case. Probably can't see what these look like. We also run a color filter, so everything they see it's either black and white to make sure that they cannot identify also the color of the t-shirt. So unless they know the grass or the ball, that is the only thing they could actually see. Yeah. this we can roll out.
Yeah, thought so.
So, any more questions and comments? Yep, Maurizio.
Hi, David. Thanks, Carlos, for the great explanation, and David for the presentation. Just quickly, follow from Rob comments. I wonder whether, of course, you selected some highlights, so it's hard to understand the action, but sometimes I can recognize like some of my favorite clubs' action from the past, just because of the motion, because I can recognize a goal was scored this way, or a very famous play from Zinedine Zidane, or like a World Cup final. Did you take that into account, like to try and confound the participants?
This is a limitation that we have to live with. If there is someone that is actually able to recognize that one play, we can't rule that out because we only have 10 videos. So ideally, we could do the same experiment with a lot more funding, like for a lot of different videos, and actually try to test a lot of different things. But with this setting that we had and the limitations that we had, that was the only thing we could do. So we have to live with this limitation. If anyone can recognize one of the plays that is in there. Yeah.
Thanks. Excellent job, by the way. I really enjoyed the presentation and really fascinating findings.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions and comments? We've got to 27 minutes of discussion now, Dave. So.
Had more than I thought we would have.
I might need to leave. Actually, I sneaked out of a thing I shouldn't have, but yeah. Happy also if anyone wants to drop an email or wants more details. Very happy to also share with them the details via email. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Carlos. No more hands have appeared, so I think we can probably call it quits at that point. Say thank you, Carlos. Thank you to Dave. Thank you to co-authors for a really interesting presentation. We now have a week's break. There's no talk next week, but we're back the following week on February the 24th with Mario Lackner. He's presenting The Older the Wiser, Determinants of Misbehavior in Team Contests. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Dave.